Howdy, my name is Frankie Jackson. I'm the coordinator of the LGBTQ+ Pride Center in the offices of the Dean of Student Life here at Texas A&M University. My pronouns are they, them. I want to thank you if you're joining us on Facebook. We have had a technical glitch, so if you see a couple of videos, that's what's going on. But I'd like to start our panel again by thanking our panelists, Martin Rosales from International Student Services, Erica Garcia from Multicultural Services, and our former student, Itzia Medrano, for taking the time to talk to us about the Latinx LGBTQ experience. We're going to start off the panel with introductions. Erica will give us an overview, and then I have some questions that the center has prepared, and then you can submit questions over Facebook. Thank you so much. And with that, Martin, let's kick introductions off.
Thanks, Frankie. Third time's the charm. My name is Martin Rosales, and I work with International Student Services as their technology coordinator. No, I was not responsible for the glitch, although sometimes I am with International Student Services. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm very honored to be here today because I feel it's really important as a Latinx gay male to speak on my experience, because I know when I was going through what I was going through in my junior high school years, I didn't really have that representation or that voice that I could cling to and really get that perspective. So that's why I'm here, and thank you so much for having me.
Erica, if you'd like to go next.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for having me today and inviting me to speak on this topic for today. So my name is Erica Garcia, as was said, pronouns she, her, hers, ella, if anybody is a Spanish speaker. And so my title at Texas A&M is Diversity Education Specialist with the Department of Multicultural Services. And sort of the main responsibility of that is I oversee a program called A2A, which is essentially in charge of peer diversity education across campus through kind of workshops and seminars. I would say that one of the biggest things that A2A kind of serves as a forefront, or theoretically rather, is the intersectional experiences of our students and students at large. And so I am speaking today with kind of those issues in mind, also from the perspective of somebody who shares a Latinx identity, specifically Mexican. And so, yeah, happy to be here, happy to share kind of the way I frame sort of the educational components of my work, and happy to share space with other co-panelists today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Itzia. I'm a former student, so I'm actually extra honored to be here because I don't have a cool title. I just commissioned into the Marine Corps, so I'm a second lieutenant. I will be going to Marine Corps training in October. But the love of my life, if you've ever talked to me, is sociology. That's what I studied at A&M. So through that, we study a lot, the intersectionality of several different things. But for me, identifying as Latinx and as a queer person, it was that specific intersectionality is very important to me. So again, thank you so much for having me, because it is a very important topic.
Excited to have all of you. And with that, Erica, you've prepared an overview for us.
Yes, I have. I'm curious if I have the screen share capability. Oh, yeah, I may not be a host.
Hold on. Okay. All right, try now.
Yes. Okay, are we good with seeing the screen? Okay, perfect. So as Frankie said and offered a little bit earlier, that what I will offer through this presentation is sort of a quick and bird's eye view of sort of Latinx identity and an introduction into some of the components of the intersections of those identities, or that identity. Latinx identities, as many of you will know, are very expansive, includes such a large kind of ethnic, racial, cultural, historical representation. And so I'm going to try my best to give sort of a quick run through in as best as I can on 10 to 15 minutes or so of some context for what shapes the Latinx identity and touch a couple of highlights. So with that being said, I think it's important to start with some demographic information, particularly as it shapes our experiences in the US. And so I'm going to go through, I won't go through everything just because it's really tedious and you all can read these kind of the specific numbers on the slides, but I'm just going to go over kind of the bigger grasp or the bigger sentiment of each of these slides. And so with respect to representation in the US, the Latino composition has drastically increased, within the last 10 to 20 years. As of the last recording of census estimates, which were 2019, I think it was about July of 2019, estimated about 60 million folks who identify as Latinx, or approximately 15% of the US population. And I added some other racial or ethnic demographics just to give a little bit of contextualizing. So folks who are white, specifically non-Latino, identify as encompass 63% of the population. Black and African American folks are 13%. Asian is at 6%. Native American or Alaskan Natives are at 1.3%. And Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders make up 0.2% of the US population. I included states that are high in Latino percentages, just because these are at times bigger indicators of kind of the Latinx experience. And in this case, you can kind of see how they make up a lot of the American Southwest. So states like New Mexico, California, Texas, Arizona, and Nevada have huge Latinx identifying folks by population percentages. And so that contributes immensely to the way we're kind of socially, politically, and in all other ways organized. This shapes, we're in an election year. And so that we see kind of sometimes these manifestations of targeting specific populations through the demographics of Latino kind of spaces. I wanted to touch on a little bit on the growth, just because I think that's incredibly important. And I included this slide to highlight sort of the degree of growth with respect to Latinos. And I chose to kind of isolate Texas just because, to speak a little bit to the context that we share, both at A&M and just, in the broader state context. Latinos as of, I think this was June 2019, census data, although the Texas Tribune were the folks who did this analysis, 11.4 million people, which is an increase of about 2 million folks since 2010. And this has been the largest kind of racial ethnic increase in the state. You can see kind of the same comparative numbers for Black and African American folks, white folks, and Asian folks, and see that, this is, or Latinos kind of sort of in growth outnumber in Texas and a lot of other states, but for purposes of our conversation on experiences today, that is, I chose to highlight Texas. Latinos also inhabit, about half of Latinos inhabit the state's largest counties. And so that includes Harris, Bexar, Dallas, Tarrant County, and Travis. These coincide with some of the largest, or are representative and indicative of the largest cities in Texas. I wanted to break down kind of sort of a misnomer that I think there's often that is left out of like Latinx conversations and Latinx identity sort of parsing of data and information. And that is kind of ethnicity representation. And so I'm sure to a lot of Latinx folks, these numbers are pretty telling of like what we observe. And those of us who are more aware of kind of the ethnic diversity within Latinx, the umbrella of the Latinx term. I won't go over, like I said, over each of them, but Mexicans, super highly represented, and this is national numbers. Puerto Ricans are a close second. As we know, Puerto Rico is part of the United States. Salvadorians, Cubans, Dominicans, Guatemalans, and then the list on and so forth. I chose to highlight Spanish folks, or thought it was interesting that this resource, in this case, it was a Pew Research Center, identified Spanish folks under the Latino designation. And there's a little bit on my slide that I'm going to talk about later on with respect to that. But I just thought that was interesting. And yes, sorry, I'm trying to make sure I included everything I wanted to say. A couple of points on disparities, and I think the biggest one that has been really salient, I would say within the last, well, for a long time, but something that has been highlighted more so recently has been that according to the Office of Minority Health, and this has been the case for a while, but Latinos have the highest rates of uninsurance. I'm sure we can parse out data there with respect to ethnic and sort of ethnicity specific numbers. But historically, that has been the trend, and that is the case. The way this impacts and affects, some of the bigger like systemic issues are a lot, and that manifests in a lot of different ways. But COVID and the disproportionate effects on Latinos is one of the biggest things that has been over the last few months in our world and in conversations. There was a quick NPR interview that I thought was really insightful that kind of parsed through some of the reasons why this may be the case. And you can see kind of some of this being sort of systemic issues. Latinos are more than likely part of the essential workforce. So those positions and critical kind of industries or parts of critical employment positions in which we've needed to navigate, the U.S. and to see us through sort of the global pandemic experience. Lower rates of health insurance, which I already talked about a little bit. For undocumented folks, there is a sentiment of lacking trust in health and government institutions for, obvious reasons relating to documentation and fearing of being, outed or put in danger. Although there is trends that demonstrate that Latinos are increasingly not immigrating, not as representative of the immigrant or undocumented immigrant population as was previously thought, or as compared to maybe 10 years ago. We also tend to live in multi-generational households. Grandma, mom, dad, kids live in those households, and that contributes to sort of when you consider like what social distancing means, and the fact that if mom or someone is symptomatic, and the fact that you may not have the space to be able to, isolate or quarantine or be at a distance in these multi-generational households. And then again, disparities contributing to the disaggregating analysis of ethnicity and ethnic origin information. So I wanted to touch on a little bit of Latin America, just because I think this is something that is left out, and I am keeping an eye on time, y'all. Just because I think the cultural context, or what informs like the perspective that Latinos have in the US, is often kind of flattened a little bit and not given kind of its proper development or processing or discussion. So this is more what my favorite kind of area to talk about is with respect to Latino kind of ethnicity, identity. But when we talk about Latin America and those things that serve to influence kind of Latinx identity, we're talking about a very big part of the world, right? We're talking about countries that are 30 plus in numbers, each having kind of cultural, racial, ethnic diversity. Although they do share kind of common historical context and experiences, there's huge amounts of variety in, for example, the Spanish language and influence, in variety of, indigenous language and cultural influence is varies to great degree according to each of these nations. And so I kind of wanted to give a quick nod to that and provided like a quick map, which I'm sure we all are familiar with, but again, just to highlight sort of that we're talking about, an area that is significantly larger than the United States, and often isn't given as much sort of exploration of kind of the diverse experiences and cultures and identities. So some common historical elements that contribute to sort of the where we're going with this, which is like LGBTQ plus notions and experiences, is that there are elements that are similar in Latin America throughout kind of folks who identify as Latino or Latinx. Indigenous native populations, for example, were original inhabitants. European colonization and settler states through the Spanish and the Portuguese mostly. Introduction of enslaved Africans and extraction of labor resources. And also other things that are not kind of frequently visited are kind of the complex and shifting dynamics with the US and what that means. And there's long historical, we can draw a whole workshop on that, but just that continued kind of relationship and what that has meant historically for Latinos and Latino nations. And then kind of the notion of mestizo or Ladino or other label for new racial identities that serve to kind of identify and serve important kind of influencers of the representation of these identities, particularly in the US, but is also important through Latin America. So this is where I wanted to steer a little bit closer to kind of our conversation for today. And I think I just have like one or two more slides. But I think these are some of the things that there's probably going to be overlap with what there is to talk about for the remainder of the of our time today. But I wanted to share that previous slide about Latin America to showcase that when we are existing as folks of Latino ethnicity or Latino descendants, we are existing in that space in the US lens. And so a lot of us bring kind of those notions, and we have that kind of background and context of our cultural and lived experiences and perspective into and woven into kind of our experiences into the US. So it's really important, I think, to keep in mind kind of the way we navigate those different lenses. Another super salient theme is the complexity of terminology, right? And that has a lot to do with kind of the history of Latinos in the US, the labeling of Latinos in the US, who was designated to be under the umbrella of, say, white racial identity, who wasn't. And I think that's another thing that's like frequently turned into like those spaces of conversation, the topics of conversation in Latinx spaces. The assumption of a monolith, I think, is really important for reasons that I've kind of already said. But the fact that, the cultural experiences of Dominicans, Costa Ricans, Argentinians, and Colombians are super different. But in the US, they would fall under the monolith of Latinx, right? And how that serves to kind of flatten a variety of identities sometimes. Disaggregating Latino kind of data, I talked about that. Ethnocentrism, I think, is super important to talk about. My cultural context is that of Latina, but specifically Mexican. And so my lived experience is going to be, inclusive of that. The legacy and history of immigration, I won't go into that in more detail. I will talk a little bit about the intersections of race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation, gender identity. As you all know, these themes are super strong, loaded, and I can talk about them for a very long time. But I wanted to kind of parse out how those experiences across like the intersection of identity are going to vary drastically, are going to vary depending on, cultural kind of, like I said, more experienced notions, depending on, what specific ethnic or cultural identity the individual has. It probably has a lot to do with immigration and notions of, identity in the US. There are also, there's also been more recent work on like the analysis and critical kind of examination of racism within Latinx communities, specifically anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity. And equally, queer and Latinx studies have also focused on, these elements, but homophobia and transphobia as well within kind of Latinx circles. Let me take a look at time here. Okay, I'm gonna skip this slide. The purpose of this is just to highlight sort of that a lot of the forces that influence notions of LGBTQ plus identity in Latin America are very much shaped by those same forces of the US. And so there's kind of subtle differences, but a lot of these notions are formed by the same place. I do want to end on this slide to talk about kind of the resurgence and connection with Indigenous identity and how that pairs with sort of the notions of gender identity and sexual orientation. There is an increased and I'll summarize this slide, but that there is an increased kind of spotlight on the ties to Indigenous identity and notions of kind of the gender binary, notions of sexual orientation, notions of gender expression, and that this is most seen, you know, one of a really good example that I can think of is kind of the third gender identities of particularly Indigenous South Mexicans. And in this case, it was a Zapotec woman, and they with respect to how they identify, there's some variation with whether they're trans women, with whether they're women, much like, you know, we know that this happens. But I chose to highlight this sort of magazine because Vogue Mexico recently, about a year ago, decided to tribute an image to these kind of Indigenous Mexicans, specifically Zapotec, that go by the name of Miche, which is a place, which is a play on the Spanish word mujer, which means woman. And I would also point to that the function of the X in Latinx studies is also a nod to both queer folks and Indigenous ancestry of Latin America. And so, yeah, just wanted to include, kind of end with this on this slide and kind of head us into the different points of conversation. I'll include a couple resources just because in case folks want to do a little bit more digging and homework, and this is some of the stuff I used to inform the workshop today. And thank you for having me today again.
Awesome. That was super informative and everything I was hoping it would be when I asked Erica to come speak for us. I thought it'd be a really great way for us to get all on sort of the same foot culturally, understanding, getting that big lens there. So it was everything we could have asked for and more. With that, we're going to jump into the panel questions. Anyone is welcome to answer these or pass as they feel comfortable. So starting off, what does it mean to be LGBTQ in the Latinx community?
Well, I personally think that that's an identity that's still being pioneered by a new generation. Because even studying it like I did in college, it's very difficult to study both at the same time because the Latinx identity is so complex. And then I grew up on a border town, so it got even more complex. Like, do I identify as American or Mexican today, you know? And then I'm still figuring out that identity. And then within my Mexican culture and my family, I'm still trying to figure out, you know, what is my identity with them as a queer woman? So I think it's a work in progress, at least for me. I don't want to speak for everyone, but the identity together, maybe like hyphenated, I think that's very much still a work in progress.
I would definitely have to agree with Itzy on that point. I also grew up in a border town. I grew up in Edinburgh, Texas, regardless of, you know, the San Francisco behind me, but I grew up in Edinburgh, Texas. And when I was presented with this question, I have a spiral notebook of all these different things. And so I might veer a little bit, but I promise there's a point. So I come from a Puerto Rican background, a Nicaraguan background. There's Guatemalan in there, Venezuelan, Spanish. I was really excited to see Spaniards highlighted, actually, because if we go all the way back to the beginning of Rosales, it's in Spain. And then when my parents remarried, we added the Cuban element to it. And so growing up, I didn't get the same connectivity that would be considered to be the norm in a Latinx household because of the divorce. And so I had, you know, the Puerto Rican identity. I had the Nicaraguan identity. I had the Guatemalan identity. My stepfather, who recently passed, he was in my life from when I was like 1 year old. So I always, you know, when you're growing up, you're like, oh, I'm also Cuban now, right? And then you're living in a border town and you're like, okay, you know, everything is kind of different. Are we really American because you pass that border checkpoint when you go to Corpus Christi, or you're going north? Or when cell phones were first introduced, you would make a call and it became international because it pinged off of you know, the Mexican cell tower. And so, you know, it was really interesting coming back to the roots when I was living with my grandmother in San Francisco before getting into my job, and seeing, you know, we have, you know, the different the generational issues. I recall, because, you know, we're so interconnected in Puerto Rican, and I would say in any Latin American or Latinx household, you know, family talks were connected. And I had the unfortunate experience of being outed by my cousin. And so my whole family knew before I did, because, you know, my cousin talked to my grandmother, who then talked to my father, who then called my grandmother my mother's side, who then, it was this whole thing. And it was just, you know, kind of dealing with that, the idea of not being able to pass on things with my father, because that was a really tough thing for him to deal with. And, you know, the kind of the idea of like the machismo, but not really, and kind of that interplay. And kind of like what Erica was talking about, we could go into this for hours. But I know that for me personally, it was very interesting being disconnected, but also connected, and dealing with that identity across state lines, and not being able to really communicate with my family members because of language barriers, you know. And in some instances, I'm first generation. In other instances, I'm third generation, and I'm losing the language. And so it was really complicated for me personally.
Erica, did you want to add anything as an ally?
I think I don't think I want to offer anything else. I think I'll just say that I agree that it, you know, it adds yet another element of identity to an already complex identity, and or a complex, you know, intersections of identity. And so I think that what, you know, the examples that our co-panelists shared are really resonate with what I feel I see in a lot of, you know, in working with you know, younger Gen Zers, and witnessing kind of their lived experiences.
Yeah, I think before we go on to our next question, it's really important to highlight that we're using the term Latinx just like very fluidly, right? But growing up, it was always Latino. And so there's even been a language change in the past couple of years. So that's just been an interesting development. So the next question we wanted to ask are, what are some misconceptions from the Latinx community?
I have a clarifying question. Is this like, what are some misconceptions about the Latinx community, or?
So I think it could be taken a couple of ways. We wrote it to be a little ambiguous. So I think it's misconceptions from the Latinx community about the LGBT identity, or possibly misconceptions about, you know, the Latinx, you know, like identity and the LGBT community. So it's just, you know, sort of how you interpret that. We wanted to get people's thoughts.
Thank you.
I'll jump in on this one to start, because like Erika, I was thinking of it in one way and also had an answer for a different way. And so I'll come from it from, again, my personal lived experience, being baptized and raised Catholic, and having that kind of be part of the family identity and part of what it is that we really used in our day-to-day life. I immediately assumed, because unfortunately of the overarching more societal pressures at the time, thinking of like what's happening in America and kind of like the 90s, and, you know, the thought process behind religion and the exclusion, or the thought process of being a gay male was a sin, right? So this, I'm kind of putting this all together. And so my immediate thought was, I can't come out to my family because the way that I've been kind of conditioned through all these different lenses was, this is probably going to be something that is not positively received. And I'm very happy to say, at least in my experience, except for a few specific individuals and the whole being outed thing, it was a positive experience for me with my family. Now, going back to the border town situation, that was so weird, because I don't know if Itzia had the same experience when she was there, but I always had this thought that feminine was bad. You needed to be masculine. Feminine is bad. Don't be feminine. You can't be feminine. Then going to the mall in McAllen, so I'm pointing at you, Itzia, going to the mall in McAllen, and there you have the super well-dressed, wearing makeup men from Mexico spending this money. And I was like, well, wait a second. Here's this very successful individual. He's spending a lot of money. He seems to be owning this femininity, and it doesn't seem to be an issue. And no one seems to really be thinking about it as an issue. And so that was kind of a misconception that I think I had, and I think that others may have who might have been brought up in this kind of disconnected experience like I did, is that, you know, Latinx from the outside looks to be Catholic, religious, looks to be machismo, looks to be masculine. But really, we're an embracing culture. We hug everybody. We kiss people on the cheek. We're very open with our hearts and very open with our emotions. And so I think that was one of the things that really hit me when I was reading the question and looking back at my lived experience, is like, if I had to go back and do it again, except for some issues with my dad, because unfortunately being a conservative Latino, or that kind of plays into it as well, with that intersection there with the politics and the religion, but it wouldn't have been that big of a deal. And I kind of wish I knew that earlier. So that's how I interpreted that question.
I think I definitely know what you're talking about. For me though, see, and this is where it starts getting even more complex, because being a female, when I came out, it was very like, and this is one of the misconceptions I touch on, where my parents, or my mom really, were like, oh, okay, does this mean, you're gonna become a man? And I was like, no, but even then I was like, that's not wrong, but I don't. I still identify as a female. Nothing is really different with me. But that inherent transphobia was there, so even now, like, my family's come to accept me more, so long as I don't start acting too masculine, because there are these very like strict gender roles. But then, like Martin was saying, on one end in my family, I was seeing these strict gender roles where men had to be manly and women had to be feminine. But then in the media, I was getting introduced to like the world of drag and like popular culture, where I was seeing all these men who were rocking like feminine aspects, and then females, or as I came to learn, non-binary people who are just rocking the androgynous looks, and I just was loving it. But it was so weird being so like disconnected from it in a border town. So I think from the Latinx community, there is a lot of misconceptions about what it means to be queer.
Could I add something, because Itzia pointed something out and it was like a light bulb moment. And if my cousins from Puerto Rico didn't have me say this, they would come through the phone and smack me. So the transphobia thing it was a huge thing with me as well. I recall specifically my mother, okay, there's a whole story, but at some point, Rocky Horror Picture Show came into the existence in my household, because that was what my mom wanted us to watch, not knowing what it was. And the immediate Frankenfurter character, she turns to me and said, so does that mean you're a transvestite? Because I was outed. I was a gay male. So obviously gay male equated transvestite. And so that kind of goes into what Itzia was saying. And then another representation in the media was, look at, I always stumble on his last name, but Walter Mercado in Puerto Rico, the most feminine thing in Puerto Rico, and is revered in the Puerto Rican community as like someone that they embraced and loved in the household. But it's like, well, wait a second, you're saying one thing, but here's something in the media that you embrace that's different. And so I just wanted to give that other example.
Yeah, I think I'll offer very quickly that to me, when I think of like common misconceptions, I think of how there's sort of this notion that the Latinx community is inherently kind of more homophobic or more transphobic than everybody else. And although I'm sure everybody in this space who identifies as Latinx has shared and can think of examples, we also see the many kind of artists and historical and important figures that have challenged that. And Walter Mercado is a prime example of that, of someone who rose, you know, in his entire fabulousness and being just himself, rose to be really kind of a sweetheart in the Latinx community and just the global community, really. I also think of Juan Gabriel, you know, the late Juan Gabriel, and his kind of artistry and contribution to, you know, Mexican identity, just Latin American music, period. And so I'm reminded, I'm a little bit older than you all, probably a older millennial, but I'm reminded of like those notions of what was in the backdrop of like my parents' psyche and my parents' culture, and how that was kind of an ever-present identity, despite being, you know, kind of in the background or not openly talked about, but whose music was consumed and celebrated and honored. And so I kind of now as an adult, when I'm reflecting on like all of the things that, you know, the queer community contributes, queer Latinx folks contribute, I also am reminded about how they've always been there. So yeah, I just wanted to add that a little bit.
I'm going to jump into one more time because Etika totally like light bulbs, right? Media and musical representation, for real, the artists and things like that, because I distinctly recall that never came into our thought process when we were listening to these artists or consuming their media. That wasn't something that was inherently brought to the conversation. It was just experiencing their art and the importance of that art. So I just wanted to definitely echo that.
Just really quick fun fact about my family. Juan Gabriel actually, I guess my uncles used to have like a band, one of them, and Juan Gabriel actually came and was like, hey, like, can I be y'all's lead singer? And my uncle's band was like, no, like, get out of here. You know, they started using all the homophobic slurs. And of course, you know, Juan Gabriel went on to be super successful. So I think that was kind of like a lesson to my family, because now it's like, they don't talk about him in a bad way, of course. Now they're just like, well, your uncle was dumb, you know, he could have been so successful had he not been so hateful. So definitely, yes.
Thank you. I didn't realize we're gonna have so much sparking, but that was really cool. If anyone is interested, Netflix did just do a Walter Mercado documentary and stuff, and so I think that's really brought it out there. And most recently in the season of All Stars for RuPaul, someone did a Snatch Game character off of that, and it was hysterical. So if people are looking to connect and learn a little bit more about that, there are those resources out there right now. So our next question we wanted to throw out was, how do you navigate multiple identities at the same time?
Carefully. And so this is, again, personal lived experience. My family is everywhere. And if we go to my mother's side of the family, we get into the white European, German, Polish, German, Jewish side of things. And so it's really difficult. And in some instances, you don't think it's difficult until you have to find yourself out of it and then trying to navigate who you are outside of that Latinx community and explaining it to others. So I went to college in Ohio. I lived in Japan. I did my master's in Alabama, and in all these different places. You know, I'm Puerto Rican, I'm Spanish. You know, I'm Casper the Friendly Ghost, unfortunately. And so it was a lot of those things where I had to decide, and I don't know if this is the right choice of words to use, but I had to decide how out I wanted to be as a gay male and how out I wanted to be as a Latin gay male, and how open I wanted to be about who I was in all of those intersections, because it's at some points it felt like I was the token one in these spaces. And so I was then expected to explain, expected to educate, expected to be that person to answer the questions, which if we look at the LGBTQ plus side of things, sometimes that occurs. And then we add the Latinx on top of it. And so it's not something that really I thought about until working in higher education and getting into student development and academic affairs, where I was like, oh goodness, this is what I've been doing. This is how I've been navigating that. And so being aware that it's there is really important. Being aware that you don't have to be the end all be all is really important. And just owning who you are. You know, just because you accidentally called it the Cuban version with the hard rice that sticks on the bottom of the pot and not the Puerto Rican version, and now your family's making fun of you for it, it's okay because you navigate both spaces. So it's kind of a macro overview of that one for me.
Can you repeat the question really quickly, Frankie?
Absolutely. So how do you navigate multiple identities at the same time?
I don't know if Itzia, you want to offer something? I have something small, but I don't want to take too much space.
I think you're good, Erica. Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So I think, again, just reflecting on like the complexity of Latino identity and what it means. I think for me personally, what it means and the work that I do through, you know, my interest or literally the work that I do for A&M. But it comes to the way I kind of center my interests and my advocacy work and what I choose to be a part of is also for advocating for folks who are who live at the intersection of being Latinx, but also are a part of other marginalized communities. And so elevating, you know, the experiences and the voices of queer Black Latinx folks, of Indigenous Latinx folks. And so what it means for me personally is also recognizing like the certain amount of privilege that I do carry with me and as I navigate these spaces. And so I, by Latin American standards, would be considered privileged in the sense that I have fairer skin, at best racially kind of ambiguous. And so just recognizing, you know, the spaces that I occupy and how I can elevate others who share identities who may not be as, whose voices may not as often be heard, or who could serve to benefit from allyship or from elevating voices. And so that's kind of how I frame sort of my experiences. And with respect to my own lived experiences, you know, I live at the intersection of being a Latina and a woman, and those two things can never be separated. You know, that experience is very different than a Latino man or a white woman. And I have to be mindful of how that shapes my lived experiences and how I educate others about my lived experiences.
Thank you. Yeah. So our last pre-center question was, what role does language play in your experience? I know when I first started teaching Safe Zone or Safe Space, the name has changed at the institution I worked at. There's sort of this struggle of like finding a gender neutral pronoun for folks in, you know, Spanish or French speaking, like the Latin, you know, Romance languages and stuff. And so that's, I think, what I think of when I think of what role language plays, but I also don't have these lived experiences or identities. So I wanted to throw it out and ask what y'all's experiences were with language.
I think, again, it gets very complicated. But I know there is a lot of debate even within the Latinx community, about whether we should even use an X, because it doesn't come naturally to the language. So there's I think this is harder, but some people add the E instead of the X, or they add like the @ sign, or they'll say like easier on the mouth sounds. So I don't think we've even come to a consensus on what the gender neutral term should be. But I think that just the effort of having it there means a lot. So whenever I see Latinx in an email or in something, I'm like, okay, that tells me that they are at least somewhat aware of how important inclusivity is. So I think just the effort there is important and worthy.
Speaking of languages, one thing that I find is a little bit difficult with this, with Romance languages, but Spanish in general, is that it's gendered. It's inherently gendered. And so when you're trying to express yourself in a way that isn't inherently gendered, but the systems that exist have the masculine and the feminine. And Itzia kind of pointed out the X is not a sound that really is used in the language in a way that it's being used. And so that's made it really interesting to navigate. And then when you bring into things like trans identities and non-binary identities, the language is really hard to navigate in some of those spaces. And then when you look at the generational aspects of it, when I think about like my grandmother, things that we think of them as kind of like the keepers of knowledge and kind of the pioneers of the culture and the family. And so it's kind of, in some instances, that's what's going to be passed down to the other generations. And so if it's not something that's coming from above, it's going to be difficult to kind of come through to the rest of the community, at least in like with my Puerto Rican family and my Nicaraguan family. And then something coming out of completely left field is I'm in a relationship with a white male, and I actually got flat out asked why the X is at the end of Latinx. And so I had to, kind of explaining, oh, well, when we look at in the English language, we, instead of Mr. and Mrs., we did mix, and then, kind of explaining that gender thing, but, or the aspects of gender in language. And it dawned on me, it's like, if we internally as Latinx are having that conversation, then those externally are also going to be kind of confused with the language aspect of it. And so I just thought that was really interesting. And I just kind of wanted to point it out from like a language point of view as a former English teacher.
I think with like a lot of other kind of the common theme of I think Latinx identity is also just the variety, and it's a very individual choice how folks choose to identify. I don't think any one way is correct or incorrect. I think there's going to be drastic generational differences, geographic locations. And so a lot of things contribute to like how folks identify. I think there has been some really good kind of more recent conversations in the media with like conjugating the X in specific in the Spanish language. And so if anyone has seen the show La Casa de las Flores on Netflix, it's a really, really good show that shows examples of like the conjugation of the X or the gender kind of the non-gendered kind of conjugation of Spanish language. But yeah, very gendered language, like a lot of the other kind of global, not only Latin root languages, but a lot of other kind of just global language. Arabic, I think, is the same way. But I think it just leads into kind of more so than what we utilize. I hope we're taking like the conversations and applying kind of learned moments from the ways in which the gendered norm of Spanish infiltrates like culturally, how that manifests, and what it means that the plural is defaulted into the masculine when we're referring to like a group of men and women, or non-binary folks. And so more so than labels, I'd hope we're taking kind of the spirit and the learning moments of those conversations, because I think they're really critical, and that show that I was talking about does it really well, investigates that really well.
Thanks. So that concludes the formal question portion of the program. We will be taking questions over Facebook Live. If y'all want to submit them in the comments, we'll get those answered. And so with that, our first Facebook question is, so Latinx families are tight-knit and like to gossip within the family. So how do you deal with family members outing you to other family members? If you are comfortable answering that question, please remember you can pass.
Well, I already said it happened to me, so I'm more than happy to answer that question. So just to make sure that I got all of the pieces of it, because we're so tight-knit, how does one handle being outed? Oh boy. Okay. So giant disclaimer, coming out in general is a personal experience. Everything's going to be different. It depends on the family unit. It depends on your relationship with your family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. With mine specifically, I personally feel like I made the mistake in trusting one of my cousins and talking to them first. And with my specific situation, she told my grandmother, who is very religious, who I later found out, unfortunately, later, when I say unfortunately, didn't really care. But that kind of damaged my perception of the relationship. That then went to my father, who then called around and was like, well, did you know? And did you know? And did you know? Who then called my mother, who he hadn't spoken to in forever, and then talked to her about it. And it made the whole situation was super awkward. You know, the normal tropes of the coming out story. Is it a phase? Are you sure you're not just bi? Maybe you haven't found the right woman or man. I don't know if anyone else had this experience, but my stepfather took it upon himself, you know, holding my hand and just making sure that I knew everything was okay, because, you know, the whole masculine, you know, subtext in the background of the culture there, of explaining his journey to finding who he was as a straight man, which I thought was very telling and interesting and personally made me uncomfortable. But that's how he found it to be able to have that conversation, is he had to kind of have that conversation about, well, this is what happened to me. Are you sure? I'm here for you. I still love you, but are you sure? Maybe we should call the priest. Wait, are you sure? Well, maybe, you know, and in certain family members, maybe we should pray on it. Maybe we should ask, you know, Mary for guidance, etc. And so after navigating that really awkward space and just being like, no, I'm pretty sure, you know, this is definitely a thing that is occurring. It's just navigating the unfortunate expectations of the family. And, you know, if you're first generation, what that might look like for, especially if you're the only male, or in some cases the only female, what that looks like in terms of, you know, cultural expectations from the family. That now isn't really a concern for my family. You know, I have a brother, so, you know, he's carrying on the torch, so the pressure's off of me now. But that was literally part of the conversation with my father, was, well, who's going to carry on the family legacy? Who's going to make sure that the, you know, this is a really inappropriate joke for my family, but who's going to make sure the Rosales gene continues to propagate? And that was kind of part of his conversation with me at that time. And so I don't know if I really got to the crux of the question, and if that individual is going through that themselves, but I can definitely say at the end of the day, I ended up with a lot closer family, because again, we are close-knit and family is family. And except for a few specific individuals, especially in the current political climate, I can say that we became a stronger family as a result. I really knew, you know, my grandmother on my mother's side had my back. My aunts had my back. My sisters didn't care. Like, I know that they're still there for me. And so hopefully that answers the question in a way that helps that individual.
I think for a lot of families, when someone comes out, it's seen as a tragedy. Like Martin said, especially when it's a man. When it's a man, it's like, oh my gosh, it's like a family scandal. In my experience, it's still kind of a scandal when it's a woman, but, and this again just goes in deeper to Latinx culture. I think women can be undervalued sometimes, and that doesn't mean that, you know, my family doesn't love me or I don't love them, but I think it's just embedded in point. So I think sometimes women are undervalued and it's not seen as such a big loss. But to anyone going through that, something that I wish I would have known, because it happened to me too. You know, my mom outed me to people and my cousins were outed to my mom. So we never, I think because Latinx families tend to be so tight-knit, it's not in our culture or habits to establish those boundaries. So for anyone who is coming out, it's okay to say like, hey, I'm trusting you with this, or maybe, you know, it just happened to come out by accident. But even then being like, I would appreciate it if you didn't tell anyone, because as obvious as that may be to us, our families, they might not even be doing it maliciously. It might not even cross their minds for it to be a secret. So it's definitely okay to be like, please don't tell anyone. I would appreciate it. And I think they would listen.
Yeah, it's the chisme, right? It's like, what's the chisme? You know, for those of you who don't know, it's gossip. And so, you know, especially in the border towns, I would have to say, right? Because even, and of course the right thing, even like in our high school community, in our local community, there was always the chisme. What was the gossip? What was happening? And so, yeah, definitely.
Thank you both, and especially Itzia for that little bit of wisdom at the end there. That was really great. So one of the pre-submitted questions that I was hoping we would have time to get to is, how do you think we can increase LGBTQ representation and use our voices? I would assume in the Latinx context of that.
I think a lot of it can be done through pop culture. So like, I came out listening to a song in the car. So I think a way to bring up those conversations is through music or a movie or a show that you really like, because it can kind of lessen that awkwardness. And at least within our families, like bringing awareness of how that culture is coming up. Even Bad Bunny, my best friend would kill me if I didn't mention him, but he's really like messing with gender norms, which is something that I don't think a lot of big Latinx stars have done in the past. You know, we talked about Walter Mercado, but Bad Bunny is kind of like a different audience, and it's a newer audience. So even just bringing up conversations about how he wears long nails or pink things could be a really cool way to dismantle that transphobia or toxic masculinity that sometimes lives within our families. Also just sparking a conversation. I think that's the best way, in a nice civil way.
My answer is going to be completely different coming from an educational side of things. And it's going to sound really cheesy in the beginning, but I promise there's a point. At some point, we have to be the voice that we need. So, you know, when I was in my master's program in Auburn, Alabama, the Latin representation, the Latinx representation was 0.6% of faculty, student body, etc. And that's when I kind of knew, you know, when I was applying for college and doing all these things, administrators, white, college counselors, white, academic advisors, white, your graduate advisor, white, your immigration advisor, white. And so I was like, okay, in order to increase that representation, I need to go for that job. I need to be that person, regardless of what the media says, regardless of what the current political climate says, regardless of how little value I think I have, I know I have it. And so I need to go and be that person. And in the international education sphere, you know, there's not a lot of gay male representation. There's not a lot of Latino or Latina or Latinx representation. It's a predominantly middle-aged white woman field. And so I know that's kind of not what the crux of the question is going to, but sometimes we just have to take ownership of who we are and show the world who we are, and get into those positions and show them that we are worthy and that we can represent that for everybody.
I think that can be really, I completely agree with you, but I do have to kind of give focus to how hard that can be. Being in the military, like in the Marine Corps, and being a Latinx queer woman, not that it's like, there's been bad experiences, but to say the least, I'm like a very rare unicorn in the Marine Corps. But I completely agree with you, because it's so important, especially as an officer. You know, I can represent and enlisted Marines or even other officers who come in and also have made it through, or even people on the outside can see, you know, people are there and people have made it. And maybe I can do that too. And that's how that percentage starts going up, you know, and that's how diversity starts happening. It's a challenge. When you see so little representation, it is very challenging, but it is also very rewarding.
I think for me, this question kind of reminds me of like being in the COVID space that we are and being more engaged with family over like group chat and stuff. We've gotten a lot closer, or the communication has been a lot more frequent. And so there's been opportunities for us to have conversations that otherwise we wouldn't have been having, because we're checking on each other so regularly. And some of that involves, you know, addressing issues of homophobia, addressing issues of transphobia, of racism, and terminology that people use, and why it's ineffective or not helpful to to their respective communities. And so I think ultimately, I think we also need to do the work like in our own families too, because I think that it's very easy as somebody who shares a Latinx identity, and in my case, for example, to hear sentiments of like anti-Blackness and not address it, whether they're referring to Black Latinos or Black Americans or the global kind of racial identity of Blackness, and to not address it because there's nothing, you know, for me to address, or feel like there isn't for me to address. But again, just advocating for those populations and being able to just call on or address those issues that happen even in your immediate family, I think is really, really important. And I think a lot of times if we don't engage in that stuff, it may not necessarily, we're also living in a really, by charged climate, I don't mean dangerous, although I do mean that can apply, but I just mean like everybody's really sensitive to these things, and not in a bad way. Like even conversations that are intended to be constructive and productive around certain issues, people can shy away from just because they're like heavy or loaded words. And I feel like it becomes even more important when the stakes are higher to address these things.
Those were three vastly different and very deep answers. So thank you all so much. I think we are at time. And so I want to give everyone the opportunity to have any closing statements or thoughts that you wanted to give before we left. And then the center will make a closing statement.
I guess I'll go first. I don't know about y'all, but I learned a lot from Erika, so huge props to her. And that was amazing. And I'm very honored that I was able to do this for you today. And, you know, just especially for that person who had that question about being outed, it does get better. You are valued, and don't ever think anything different.
I definitely want to encourage people to challenge, like Erica said, challenge that rhetoric in your family. And just to leave you all with this final thought, I took a Latinx literature class my last semester. And one of the best things we read a book, and there was this girl who was a revolutionary, and she would go out and tan. She was Guatemalan. She would go out and tan to make her skin darker. And that was so wild to me because in our culture, you know, dark is seen as bad. The darker you are, like, the less beauty you tend to have. So I found that so amazing, and it kind of made me change the way, because then I started hearing it, and the way my mom would talk to me, you know, like I would come back one summer and she'd be like, why are you so dark? So definitely like challenge that. Feel like, is there something wrong with me being so dark? Like, I like my skin, you know? So things like that, and that can definitely transfer over to the queer rhetoric, sometimes anti-queer rhetoric community. But thank you so much for having me. I loved having this discussion and love learning from my co-panelists. So thank you.
I think I'll just close with saying thanks for having me today. Thanks, Frankie, for the invite. I'm happy to talk about you know, the intersection of LGBTQ and Latinx identity and or other identities. I'm happy to be a resource to students as well who want to perhaps process some of these notions or these intersections, and also provide kind of sort of those validating experiences for what students feel and the challenges and that are very real and that can feel overwhelming at times. So thanks for having me. Happy to continue talking to you all, and everybody take care, be safe.
So thank you again to our panelists. This was a richly deep conversation for me. I feel like I learned so much, and I hope our folks in the audience also learned. If y'all liked this program, we'll be having Pride Lives for the rest of the semester. Our next one will be on October 13th, and it'll be talking about LGBTQ health. The center is also hosting a documentary showing next week, Born to Be, on September 15th at 7 p.m. Central Time. And that will be on the trans surgical experience. So if you're interested, please sign up for that. Thanks, y'all, and good night.